the first letter of Peter, chapter 4, verses 12 through 16, and chapter 5, verses 6 through 11. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that is taking place among you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you are sharing Christ's sufferings, so that you may also be glad and shout for joy when his glory is revealed. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory, which is the Spirit of God, is resting on you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, a criminal, or even as a mischief maker. Yet if any of you suffers as a Christian, do not consider it a disgrace, but glorify God because you bear this name. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. Discipline yourselves, keep alert. Like a roaring lion, your adversary, the devil, prowls around looking for someone to devour. Resist him, steadfast in your faith, for you know that your brothers and sisters in all the world are undergoing the same kinds of suffering. And after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, support, strengthen, and establish you. To him be the power forever and ever. Amen. Well, Peanuts is one of my favorite cartoons, and there was a point at which Snoopy was trying to write a novel. And as he was trying to write a novel, Lucy reads the draft, and she says, the stories are bland, and she says, the trouble with you is that you've never really suffered. So he's like, your stories are terrible because you've never actually suffered. You have nothing to tell because you haven't actually suffered. Now, sometimes it's easy for people to walk into a church and think that they're the only one suffering or the only one who has suffered. Okay, and it's absolutely not true. You know those speech bubbles over cartoon characters? One of the things I always say is that as the pastor, I can look out on a congregation and I see speech bubbles over everyone's head. Okay? Some weeks it just says, I'm bored. But but other weeks, you sit there and you can look out and you know who's been going through what. And I guarantee you, everyone has had their times where the speech bubble over their head was saying something really, really difficult, that they were going through a really hard time, and they weren't sure if anyone else understood. They weren't really ready to talk about it, and they just were going through it. And when this has happened to us, none of us have enjoyed it. But one of the reminders is that you weren't alone. I mean, I love the way Peter phrases this in the letter. He says, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that is taking place, as though something strange were happening to you. It's not strange. Peter's people are suffering, and he says, don't be surprised. It's not strange. See, faith doesn't protect us from ever suffering. It's not the insulator from suffering. It is that which sustains us through it. We rely on faith to get through the periods of suffering that we face. It's not that faith will prevent us from suffering. You always remember, we worship a God who went to the cross. Okay? Suffering is a part of our story, and what we understand is that faith is what sustained Jesus. Faith is what sustains us as we go through it. But no matter what, when you live, life includes suffering. And sometimes this is a little harder for folks to understand. My first career was in software, and I had my own business. I didn't encounter all that many people, and the people I generally encountered, it was more superficial. I mean, so you would talk to folks, and I still remember, and they were really reluctant to share what was going on in their lives because you were talking business. I still remember this one conversation I had with a guy. We had a meeting scheduled for a day, and he calls me up. He calls me up and he says, I just need to warn you. He goes, I'm really sorry, but I need to warn you that my wife is in her 9th month of pregnancy, and if she has the baby, I'm going to have to cancel our meeting on Tuesday. And he was kind of worried that I would be upset. And the only thing I could say to him is, if we got to the meeting on Tuesday and you told me that your wife was in labor and you were here, I wouldn't want to do business with you. I wouldn't want to do business with a person who would do that, okay? But you didn't have that much of an opportunity. You'd have the occasional coworker, who had something tragic happen in their lives, but it didn't happen all the time. And so when I became a pastor, and you start dealing with, people in hospitals all the time, and you have funerals all the time, that kind of thing, and I had friends who would say, "Isn't that depressing to have to do that?" And I said, "No, it's not depressing, it's sad. There's a difference between sad and depressing." I said, "It's sad, but I've come to a greater appreciation for how it's just a part of life. That we all get to spend a certain part of our lives. There will be some time that we spend in the ER, some time that we spend in the OR, some time we spend in the waiting room, in the surgical waiting room, all those kinds of things. We're going to spend some time there. And it's just a part of what life is." And what's interesting is that we try to ignore it. We try to pretend like the suffering isn't supposed to be a part of life. In fact, what's really cool is the development of the word in Greek that refers to suffering. It's this word Paschos, from which we get like the paschal lamb, the sacrificial lamb at Easter. But what's interesting about that word is that it came to mean suffering. But the original meaning of the word in Greek was it just meant to experience life, to experience whatever befell someone, whether it was good or bad. So that's all it meant. Paschos was life throws something at you, and you experience it. And it might be joy, and it might be suffering. And then over time, the meaning evolved so that it only referred to the bad, that you only used it to talk about the bad. You presumed the good, so you didn't even feel the good anymore. You presumed it, so it didn't count as Paschos anymore. Only the suffering was Paschos. You only noticed the bad. And I thought, wow, is that a metaphor for the human condition? And this is 2,000 years ago, okay? We want to just forget. We want to presume that it's good, and it's supposed to be good. It's kind of like Lucy in another cartoon. Someone, I forget who it was, whether Linus or Charlie Brown, says to her, "Don't forget, life has its ups and downs." And her response was, "Why?" She said, "Why can't it just be ups? Why do there need to be downs?" She goes, "I just want ups. I want ups, and I want more ups." And I'm like, yeah, that's the human condition. We only want ups. And that leads to this false expectation that we deserve to have a life that is just the ups and not the down. It leads to this expectation that when there is the negative that happens to us in life, it's extraordinary and shouldn't be. And the problem with that is that once you believe you have a right to a life free of suffering, the periods of suffering become more difficult to deal with appropriately. See, Peter warns, he says, "Discipline yourselves, keep alert. Like a roaring lion, your adversary, the devil, prowls around looking for someone to devour." See, if suffering throws you off, it gives the enemy an opportunity to take advantage of you. All right? Because you believe, I don't deserve this. All right? For example, how do you get a person to steal from their employer? Convince them that they're being treated badly. You're being underpaid, so make it up out of the cash register. Okay? Convince them that they're being treated badly, and that is the temptation to rationalize what they do that's wrong, because they believe that they're not doing anything wrong, they're just balancing the scales. They're just equalizing. So there's a great temptation that comes with the desire to avoid suffering. There's a great temptation that says that I shouldn't have to suffer. It shouldn't be a part of my life. So I can compromise what I believe in. I can compromise my ethics in order to avoid the suffering. Happens all the time. When you ask people, why did you cave into the temptation to do what was wrong? And they're like, because I didn't want the consequences. I didn't want what would have happened otherwise. They weren't willing to suffer, so they compromised their principles. And so Peter knows that this might happen, and so he says, look, let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, a criminal, or even as a mischief maker. That last one will get me every time. Yeah, I'm not really liable to murder, theft, basic crime. Mischief, that's tempting. But he makes this plain, don't suffer for wrong. Don't think that you're making life even by doing this, all right? Break this correlation that you might have in your mind between righteousness and suffering, all right? You're not extra righteous if you do suffer. If you do suffer, that doesn't make you righteous, all right? And being righteous doesn't shield you from it. Suffering happens to the righteous and to the unrighteous. As Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, right? Rain falls on the just and the unjust. So all you can do is that in your period of suffering, you can decide that I'm going to hold on to my principles. I'm going to hold on to my principles. I'm going to live the way I ought to live, whether things are going well or whether things are going poorly. When things are going badly for me, I will hold on to my principles. I will continue to be honest. I will continue to do what's right. I will continue to honor God with my life, whether things are bad or good. What happens will happen, and through it all, I'm going to be righteous anyway. And I'm not going to worry about what's going to happen. See, I love this phrase, and it's the hardest thing. All right? The most difficult thing in life, this has never worked, is to say, when he says, cast all your anxiety on him, right? I think the most ineffective phrase in the English language is, don't worry about it. I've never known anyone who said, oh yes, I shall stop. I was worried, but you said don't worry about it, so I shall stop. No. But the thing here that's most important is when Peter says cast all your anxiety on him, there's a because he cares for you. God's looking out for you. God actually cares. It's not don't worry about it and God's indifferent. If God were indifferent, I would worry. Because God cares, I can cast my anxiety on him. And the thing about this is that word cast your anxiety on him, the imagery in the Greek is kind of like the imagery of like throwing a blanket on like a horse. All right? It's like throwing a blanket on a horse. Like just cast your anxiety on him. Let Jesus bear the weight of your anxiety. Let Jesus bear the weight of your worry. In other words, instead of just telling people, don't worry about it, instead the way I would phrase it is this. Let Jesus do your worrying for you. I'm just going to let Jesus worry about it. I'm not going to say don't worry about it. I'm going to let Jesus worry. And if Jesus says, don't worry, I've got this, it's okay. But I'm going to let Jesus do my worrying. If Jesus didn't care, I couldn't do that. But because Jesus actually does care about us, does actually care about what happens in our lives, I can let Jesus do my worrying for me. And so if I'm not worried, or I've cast my worry onto Jesus, what do I do next? It says, after you've suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, will himself restore, support, strengthen, and establish you. Little while. That's a hard phrase to digest. How long is that? Okay. The only thing we all know from our experiences is that that little while is really long while you're in it and much shorter after you're past it. Okay. When you look back on it, it's not nearly as long as it was as when you were in it. When you're in it, nights feel like weeks. Days feel like months. And afterwards, it was a blink. But this promise is fantastic, that on the other side of it, Jesus will restore, support, strengthen, and establish you. Now, that's great. It's a wonderful promise. But it's not enough, I think, to just get through your period of suffering. I want to close out with a story that I read. And it ended with a statement that really kind of haunted me all week thinking about the message. And the story was this. It was when John Paul II was Pope, so it's not that long ago. But the story is that a bunch of priests were making a pilgrimage to go see Pope John Paul II. And one of the priests had injured his leg. And so his leg was in a cast, and he was limping, and it was difficult. And when they get to Rome, and they have an audience with the Pope greets each one of them individually. So they line up, and they each go up, meet the Pope, and the Pope has a word for each of them. Finally, they get to the priest who has the injured leg. I mean, it's going to heal. It's not, like mutilated or anything. It's just injured, but he's on crutches. He's limping. And he limps up to the Pope. And the Pope embraces him and whispers in his ear, because it was a private word that he had with each one. And he just said this: "Don't waste your suffering." And that statement actually kind of haunted me all week. Because in the periods of suffering that I've had, and that we've all had, I made it through. So at each point, I learned the lesson that I could get through whatever it is that I faced by the grace of God, that God got me through all of those periods. But I then wanted to reflect on those periods in my life and ask myself, which ones did I waste? And what does it mean to waste it? To learn nothing from it? Be a piece of it. To not make changes that would keep me from repeating what got me into trouble in the first place? That's a piece of it. To allow that period of time to drive me further away from God because of the suffering, rather than in the suffering allow that period of time to bring me closer to God. I started thinking about all the dimensions through which I might have wasted or not wasted the periods of suffering I had been through. And I realized some I didn't waste, and some I did. So in the midst of it, in the midst of what you're going through, don't just look to the end of the story. Don't just look to getting past the period that you're in. But think also, how can I make the most of what I'm going through? Because if I'm going to have to go through it, I ought not waste it. If I'm going to have to go through it, I want it to strengthen my character, strengthen my relationship with God, strengthen my relationship with my friends, my loved ones. Learn to be more interdependent with others. Learn what I have inside me. Learn how God is there for me. All of these different ways in which I can use that period of suffering. Not waste it. Not just say, let me get past it and get out of it. But to say, how can I maximize where I am in it? For my good, for the good of the world. Amen.